This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I love doing this podcast. So damn fun to be in school nonstop. Oh, now, of course, I run my life. I do my thing. I've got a little bit of an affection for this topic called trend following. But I also love that other side of me that can reach out to an author, like my guest today, Christopher Ryan, author of Sex at Dawn, The Prehistoric Origins of Modern Sexuality. Chris dives right into the topics that no one wants to think about or talk about in our modern age of a 50% divorce rate. And Chris goes back in time to look at the evolution of monogamy in human beings. This is complicated stuff. This is messy stuff. I think we forget way too often that we are animals, primates. We're big fucking monkeys. Let's get real. We do crazy stuff. And that crazy stuff goes all the way to the bedroom, all the way to relationships, to families, you name it. It's one big mess. In Chris's book, he maps out a scenario where it was not once a mess. And that about 10,000 years ago, us Homo sapiens really went into a direction that perhaps we can really look at today and say, gosh, that was the turning point. That was the inflection 10,000 years ago. Now, I'm sure some of you out there that are professed traders only care if I have a trend-following guest on this program. Now, listen, I understand that you might be some odd individual that's locked in your mom's basement in your tidy whities, and the only thing you want to hear is the latest guru on Twitter telling you some BS, some bullshit about some signal that just went off. Now, don't get me wrong. I love giving the insights to good trading. But I, again, in my parallel life, my parallel mind, I'm so fortunate on this podcast to have great guests like Christopher Ryan. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I'm thinking about this subject, and I've did a deep dive into your world. From my perspective, the biggest question, the biggest question I have for you to start, and I think this opens up the conversation, is I start to think about pair bonds in the modern age, couples in the modern age that are having children. And the question I have for you in your research, have we been able to put any kind of number or percentage at women who are having children in a pair bond where the child is coming from an affair or a cheat and the husband doesn't know?
Well, there's some research around that, which interestingly first came to my attention when I was working in a hospital in Spain, helping doctors publish their research. I was doing some editing and translating for them. These were doctors who worked in transplants. The hospital in Barcelona is one of the leading hospitals in the world in doing kidney and liver transplants. And because of transplantation, they needed to do pretty intense genetic testing of the family. So this information was coming to their attention sort of as a byproduct of something else that they were working on. And I think the rate there was something around 10 to 12%. It's higher than that in some populations and lower in others, but I think that's sort of a number that we can work with. Of course, there's nothing comprehensive that can be done in this, but I think it's roughly around that.
But it doesn't surprise you, does it?
No, there's so many other factors involved, right? Because we're talking about the absence of birth control in these cases, where you'd think if you were having an affair, you'd want to be extra careful about that. But then there is research that we discussed in Sex at Dawn that shows that women who are ovulating are less likely actually to use birth control. They're more likely to wear lots of jewelry and makeup and dress more provocatively and to use less birth control. So I think there's a level at which we think we're more consciously in control of our behavior than we really are. And that comes to the fore in our sexuality as well as in some other areas of life.
I just thought that was a good opening question to get people thinking right out of the gate, because you make the case, and I have a hard time disagreeing with you. I have noticed across the web that there are some prominent names that throw criticisms your way, but every time I get into the criticisms, they seem to be skin deep. They seem to be kind of like perhaps arguing with a method or something, but they're not really getting at the crux of the issue, which I think most people, if they just take a step back and say, gosh, are we really all kind of promiscuous at heart? I don't know how the question is anything but yes.
Yeah. I was on a TV show once with two men, scholars, and we were sort of talking about these issues. And after the interview was over, they were taking our mics off and all that. And one of the guys said to me, your book sounds interesting and all that, but I'm totally monogamous. And the other guy said, yeah, me too. My wife's the best. I would never think about being with another woman. I said, well, that's fine, because I always make this distinction where, I'm not saying what people should do, and I'm not saying that everyone's the same, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with monogamy. All I'm doing is saying our species, there's good reason to believe that our species evolved in a certain way that involves a lot of sexual promiscuity. I said to the guys, do you guys look at porn? And they said, yeah. I said, do you always look at pictures of your wife? Like, no. Do you always look at the same woman? No. Is it a different woman pretty much every time you look at porn? Yeah. Well, then don't tell me you're monogamous. Your behavior might be monogamous, but your impulses aren't. And what we're talking about here are impulses.
Speaking of impulses, you had an example. I believe this is in the text. Florida State, which I happen to go to grad school there, a nice little example of surveying on the street. Why don't you relay that story right to impulse, huh?
That was, I don't remember the name of the researchers, but it's often cited in the evolutionary psychology literature to demonstrate that men and women approach the question of casual sex very differently. I think that, if I remember correctly, that it was an attractive young man with a clipboard who went around and just sort of randomly walked up to women and said, hey, I've seen you around campus. I'd love to have sex with you. What do you say? And of course, all the women said no and walked away. And then they flipped it and had the attractive young woman walking around approaching men like that. And virtually all of the men said yes. And even the ones who said no tried to, get a rain check for another time. So the researchers say, see, that proves that men and women approach casual sex totally differently. Women aren't interested in it at all. But they didn't take into consideration the incredible dangers, reputational damage, what kind of man in a sex-phobic culture like this is walking around just asking women he doesn't know to have sex. They looked at it totally out of context, and yet because it seemed to confirm their underlying assumptions, it's cited as being solid research.
Here's the real takeaway as we start to dive in here. It's a comment from your TED Talk. The contradictions between what we're told we should feel and what we actually do feel generates a huge amount of unnecessary suffering. We were talking earlier about the pair bond there and couples and stuff. My gosh, what is the current divorce rate? I mean, just if we were just to be statisticians for a second, if you're flipping a coin and that's the chance of success for a pair bond in, let's just say America, that's terrible odds. That's not good.
Yeah, I often say, if half the airplanes that took off fell from the sky, I think we'd be looking at redesigning airplanes. Right? We wouldn't be insisting, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine. This is the way it's meant to be. Roughly half the people who get married are divorced. And then we have to look at the people who don't get divorced. How many couples are together despite the fact that they're miserable? Because of the kids, because of the money, because of the family integration and the history, shared history. I mean, there are a lot of reasons people stay together aside from the fact that they have a wonderfully happy relationship. I'd say the odds of success, if we're defining it as long-term happiness, are less than half.
Let's take this back in time. I had an anthropologist on this podcast recently, and we were talking about language, the evolution of language, and I mentioned that I'd read something that certain cultures were influenced by bird sounds and other cultures were influenced by primate sounds, monkey sounds, whatnot. And this anthropologist politely reminded me, Michael, we are primates.
Yeah, exactly.
It's stealing a little bit of a line from you that we forget this, right? We are essentially just big monkeys.
Yeah. I don't know when you're going to release this, but there's a controversy in the news right now because Donald Trump apparently called immigrants animals. It always strikes me when someone refers to humans as animals. We are animals. We're all animals. If you want to be more specific, we're primates. And if you want to be more specific than that, we're apes. But we're not. This sort of unspoken assumption that we are separate from the animal kingdom, we're separate from the natural world is not only scientifically absurd, but it's also extremely damaging because it puts us in this strange space of being accepted from the rules of reality and nature, and it feeds into this strange sort of sense of immortality that I think influences a lot of very bad decisions that we make in how we treat each other and ourselves in the natural world.
Keep going back in time for me. Let's start to talk about the ape that perhaps, we've already mentioned promiscuity, we're talking about relationships, and where we evolved from. And let's start to put your best professorial hat on where that shift was about 10,000 years ago. And then we kind of bring it back up to today some. But why don't you take it back in time to perhaps, look, the current Homo sapiens, we think in our current construction, about 200,000 years we've been around. What was going on from, 200,000 years ago until about 10,000 years ago?
This information is changing pretty quickly, actually. When Sex at Dawn was published in 2010, 200,000 years was the standard understanding of anatomically modern humans. About 2 years ago, some discoveries were made in Morocco that have pushed that back to around 300,000 years now. That's the latest research shows that anatomically modern humans. So these are people who look like us, physically, brain capacity roughly the same as ours, probably a bit larger than ours actually, came onto the scene at least 300,000 years ago. From 300,000 years ago until the advent of agriculture and settled villages, roughly 10,000 years ago at the earliest, people were living in bands of foragers, also called hunter-gatherers, nomadic immediate return, which means that there was no storage of food or other resources, that things you went out and found food and ate it with that day. There's no refrigeration or complex processes for storing seeds and nuts and things like that. So that's how our ancestors lived. And there's a remarkable consistency in the sort of social relationships that grow out of that ecological condition. Because there's no opportunity to accumulate resources, egalitarianism is the universal social pattern that we find in hunter-gatherers all over the world. I'm not talking about noble savages here. I'm talking about the fact that when you live together in these very interdependent groups, it doesn't make sense for me to try to hoard resources for myself. A, because I have to carry everything everywhere we go, and we're moving constantly as we, overfish or overhunt one area, we're moving into new areas. So it doesn't make sense to accumulate a lot of material possessions. And the other point is that hunting is notoriously unreliable way of getting food. So most of the food, actually, most of the calories was the result of the women's work, gathering tubers and nuts and seeds and small animals they'd catch with nets and things like that. And the men typically would go out hunting the larger game. Depending on the environment, sometimes they hunted in a group and sometimes they hunted individually. But if you're hunting individually, you're not going to get something every day. And when you do get something, it's going to be too much food. If you get an impala or something like that, it's too much food for you and your woman and your child, right? It would make no sense to try to keep it for yourself and have it spoil. So you share it. And in Africa, in fact, my wife, who grew up in Africa, told me this beautiful expression, which is that the best place to store extra food is in your friend's stomach. And I think that's sort of the way that our ancestors approached resource allocation until the advent of agriculture. And again, I want to really stress, this isn't because they were noble savages. This isn't because they're better people than us. It's just that when you're in that kind of environment, it makes much more sense to share than it does to try to hoard. Because today I got an Impala, tomorrow I probably won't, but someone else probably will. So this way we all eat all the time. And so you see that same sort of interdependency and taking care of each other extends into other parts of life as well. People generally shared arrows. They share access to other resources, not only food, like medical care, the spirit world, all these sorts of things. People are extremely interdependent and egalitarian. So you don't get these hierarchical kind of political structures. You don't get people who impose leadership on the rest of the group. The politics of hunter-gatherers is very interesting because it's basically exactly the opposite of what we have now, where if you are in a hunter-gatherer group, you become a leader because other people respect what you have to say. You don't become a leader because you want to be a leader. In fact, expressing any interest in becoming a leader makes you ridiculous, extremely unlikely to ever be listened to by anyone because that's seen as a personality defect.
It all starts with cooperation.
Starts and ends with cooperation and interdependency, taking care of one another. So women typically breastfeed one another's kids. And so in the context of this, if a child's crying, the adult closest to the child picks him up, sees, what's going on. So children have a sense that they have many parents, that all the adults care for them. The food is shared. In fact, the hunt, it's very seen as very bad form for the best hunter to be boastful or to take more meat than anyone else. It's extremely important, and there are many mechanisms that I get into in the book I'm writing now called Civilized to Death. I get into this in more depth, but there are many social mechanisms to sort of preserve and protect this social harmony and keep anyone from getting too big for their shoes. So what happened with agriculture is that all of this changed. A radical reconfiguration of social systems. Women lost their status of being equal to men, independent, autonomous, dignified human beings, and they became more equivalent to farm animals, breeding material for men. If you read that famous line in the Old Testament, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," many people, myself included, assumed that was basically saying, be cool about your neighbor's marriage. Don't intrude on their relationship. It's a sacred relationship. Whereas if you read that in context, what it says is, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his ox, nor his house, nor his servants." And it goes on listing his possessions. So women became possessions. Land became ownable. Domesticated animals came onto the scene. They're ownable. This was probably the first time that people really started to understand that sex caused babies, because there's really no reason to make that connection if everyone's having sex and women are getting pregnant sometimes. And as you probably read in Sex at Dawn, we talked about several cultures that still don't really understand that sex causes babies. So once those things started to come into this new configuration where people have property, women have lost their freedom and sense of personal agency, and men are very concerned about sort of preserving the accumulated property that they've been able to acquire over their lifetimes and pass it on to their own child, then this is where men start becoming very attentive to women's sexual behavior and very controlling of women's sexual behavior, because that's the only way to know that is my son who's getting my farm and my sheep and my house when I die.
What you just described in the last 3 or 4 minutes, are there any critiques out there? I mean, to me, it just seems perfectly rational, reasonable, makes sense. Look, I don't have the experience you have, but I have a hard time saying, I'm a bright guy. I've talked to a lot of interesting people. I have a hard time shooting an arrow through that and saying, oh, it's all completely wrong. Are there critics out there, though, that what you just described, that shift from the hunter-gatherer into agricultural times, are there people out there that give criticisms that you step back and say, well, you might have a point there? Or are most of the criticisms just something that don't have good logic behind them? Or they're just debating with you about your research methods or whatnot?
I mean, there's certainly details in the story that I just outlined that are debatable, but no one, to my knowledge, is debating that this essential shift in human social organization took place as a result of humans living in settled villages as opposed to nomadic foraging groups. And that shift took place around the time of the first evidence for agriculture. Now, there's some evidence that people lived in settlements with a little, what's called horticultural. So they've got gardens, they've got a little bit of grain maybe, but they're still mainly living off hunting. This is in the Fertile Crescent, just around 1,000 years or so before the first evidence of agriculture. We do start to see evidence of settlements, but people are still living as egalitarian hunter-gatherers. So it's not as maybe as 1 + 1 = 2 as I laid it out. There are subtleties and nuance to it that people can debate. But the essential outlines of that, which is that hunter-gatherers tend to be egalitarian, that they share resources, that women have a status roughly equal to men. This is not debatable. Any anthropologist will tell you that that's the way hunter-gatherers live. And as I said earlier, it's not a commentary on any sort of superior moral framework that they have or substance or essence. It's simply that that's the most efficient way for everyone to survive in a hunter-gatherer economic system. That's the best way that people are going to survive. It's the best risk mitigation system. It's basically like insurance policies, right? Today I need you, tomorrow you need me. We take care of each other. That's how we survive. Otherwise we don't. We're not a species that does well on its own. We're a species, we're not very fast. We're not very strong. Our eyesight isn't very good. You pick any thing that humans do, there are lots of animals who do it much better. Some of them predators who would be, after us. What we do better than any other animal is form these social networks. We cooperate. We become a superorganism. We sort of join into like a hunting group. No man can take down a mammoth, but 5 men can take down a mammoth. Yeah, nobody would argue with the basic outlines of what I said. I'm hesitant to agree with what you said earlier about how the critiques seem to be kind of surface level. I feel like there's a lot of the critiques I've read tend to be driven by emotion. I understand where people are coming from. I think that there's the emotion of feeling personally uncomfortable about being told that something that you've believed to be true your whole life might not be. And I'm very sympathetic to that. That's a disturbing kind of experience to have. And I think, frankly, as far as like the academic stuff goes, I think there's resentment of the fact that Casilda and I, my co-author and wife and I, sort of came out of left field, and people who have been working in the trenches their entire lives had never heard of us, and suddenly this book's getting a lot of attention. And so I think there's some sort of professional resentment, which, again, I'm sympathetic to. I don't blame anyone for that.
I think I saw you say the same thing, but just so you know, from my background, I'm coming from a standpoint where my grandparents got to over 50 years in marriage. My parents are over 50 years in marriage. I'm never going to get there. I'm not going to make it. I've had this kind of perspective, but I think I've seen things that my grandparents and parents have never seen. I look at it again when I talked about the divorce rate. I say, gosh, isn't this all but for a flip of the coin? It really is. I think we don't think about the modern pair bond in terms of luck in many ways. But before we even go that way, I want you to give an example, because you kind of referred to some cultures a few minutes ago. There's a modern culture in China that kind of practices exactly what you're describing, where the father is not really known and the group is raising the child. Am I getting this wrong?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. It's the Mosuo you're talking about.
Southwest China, I think.
Yeah, they're very interesting. They constitute a society that should not exist if the fundamental principles of the sort of Darwinian view of human sexual evolution were true, because the fundamental principle there is that what we call the standard narrative in Sex at Dawn is this idea that everyone, even people who don't read the science or aren't particularly interested in this, everyone's heard this narrative, which is that men trade resources to women in exchange for their fidelity. So I will take care of you. I'll share my meat with you. You can sleep in my shelter. I'll protect you from other men and predators and all that, as long as I know that you're only having sex with me, because I need to know that all this investment is going into my genetic legacy. So that's sort of the basis of the standard narrative, which seems to make sense until you start to really look at the details. And you find societies like the Mosuo, where women are, when they become mature, they get a room in their mother's house called the flower room, which has a door that opens into the courtyard of the house, and then another door that opens to the street. And the girl sleeps in that room, and she can open her door to anyone she wants. So a different man every night can spend the night with her, or can be the same man, or it can be no man. She can do whatever she wants. Her sexual life is her own business. And when she gets pregnant, the responsibility for raising the child, as you alluded to, falls to her and her sisters and her brothers. The biological father of the child is a non-issue. They either don't know who the father is or don't care who the father is. Sometimes they know just because the kid looks so much like him, but he has no obligations, no particular role to play in that kid's life. That sort of paternal role is not biologically programmed into humans. That's a cultural conceit. And similarly, there are societies in the Amazon, at least 6 or 7 of them still in existence now, that have no connection with one another, no common language, no trading relationships. So we know that this characteristic arose individually in these different societies. And they practice what anthropologists call partible paternity, which is that they believe that a fetus is literally made of accumulated semen. And when girls start to menstruate, they're sort of like half pregnant, but until they accumulate enough semen, they won't become fully pregnant and start to form a fetus in their bodies. A woman who wants to have a child who has certain characteristics, like, everyone does. You want to have a child who's smart and funny and good looking and a good, athlete, physically strong. She'll make sure that she has sex with the men who she thinks are smartest and funniest and best looking and, physically strongest and all that, to get the essence of all these different men into her child. And then when the child's born, the different men will all acknowledge their paternity. So fatherhood is like a group endeavor in these societies.
There's no doubt, even in modern life, so many cultures are set up to where men control women, as you outline, right? That's. I think we can all kind of agree. I mean, you could look at some of the attire that women are forced to undertake, female circumcision. I mean, there's a lot of practices out there that are just abhorrent. I don't care. If someone's listening and they say, well, Michael, that's your opinion. No. Cutting people up and making them wear clothes you can't see them and they don't get to choose. That's abhorrent. It's 2018. We should be able to say that, right? But here's where it starts to get interesting for me is like, how do we start to use some of the insights that you've put together in a positive way? I look at myself and I say, I don't want to control any woman. At least this is what I think. Maybe you would come back to me and do a full analysis and say, well, Michael, some of your behaviors could be a little controlling. But I want to see a woman have her passion, doing her thing, and then ultimately it's a sharing between me and her. But on the flip side, I don't want to be in a situation, I don't feel comfortable in a situation where I don't know if potentially the child could be mine, or just the cheating in general, the sharing in general. I don't think I'm a bad guy for having that feeling. And I'm sure you've talked to many guys that have that feeling, kind of guys that are really not trying to control women, but they still have some of this impulse since the agricultural revolution, to where they don't want to be using the phrase cuck. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there are different levels to this. One is that I think some of that feeling is in fact innate, even among these hunter-gatherers that we're talking about who live in very egalitarian societies where women are deeply autonomous. Jealousy still arises, and men still fight over women, and women fight over men, and this is a source of social conflict. I'm not arguing that these people are all totally at peace with this. And in fact, some of the promiscuity happens very discreetly. And also I'm also not arguing that our ancestors didn't have possibly lifelong, unique pair-bonded relationships. I'm just saying that the evidence is quite clear that they weren't sexually exclusive. So to some extent, I think that sort of fearfulness and insecurity and discomfort with someone that you're very attached to and connected with will have other connections. I think there's some natural source for that. But I think that we live in a society that amplifies that insecurity, whereas these societies that we're talking about are very specific about dampening it. We talk about some of that in Sex at Dawn, some of the rituals and mechanisms to sort of keep everybody cool about that. So I think it's malleable. And I also think that it's very important to have an appreciation for how difficult it is to separate in human behavior and experience from that which arises biologically and that which arises culturally. That's why we open the book talking about food and how some of the foods that hunter-gatherers eat are absolutely disgusting from our perspective. There are these grubs that they love in Australia that, they're just absolutely horrible. And when the British were first there, they wrote back about how these poor people were starving to death because they were eating these insects. And yet they were kind of relaxed and happy and seemed healthy. So they weren't starving. In fact, they just were eating insects. And, there are lots of people who eat insects. You're in Southeast Asia. I've had grasshoppers in the streets of Bangkok many times. It took me some getting used to, but I finally did. It's very arbitrary what makes us comfortable or uncomfortable, and it's very much controlled by culture, but the experience feels as if it's very natural and sort of, embedded in our genes. Just because something feels very natural and deep doesn't necessarily mean that it is.
Let me keep you on women for a second. I think one of the most interesting pieces of information that you put into your work is that during ovulation, the desire, the biological desire, perhaps to some degree even unconscious, the desire that, it could be the time where the reaching out to the other male outside of the relationship is more likely to happen. I'm curious what women say about that, because here we are, we're two guys talking about women right now, right? What do women say about that feeling, that moment? Because it is a really interesting thing that is, from a guy's perspective, it just makes you feel like, my gosh, if I do put all the time and energy into a relationship, and then the woman that I'm in a relationship with has this urge that perhaps is not even part of her, her rational thinking. It's just, I must. It's messy.
Yeah, well, life is messy. And it's not women's fault. The first thing I would say, you're right, we're two guys talking about women here. I think we need to be very sensitive and careful to mention the fact that women have been operating under an incredible amount of of pressure, social pressure for thousands of years, where women who dared to be honest about their sexual feelings were ostracized at best and burned at the stake at worst. Even in language, you're a bastard, she's a whore. It's like all these words, the ways that we insult people are so tied into this sort of, the lack of fidelity or what we consider to be decency of women. Even the idea of adultery did not refer to the men's sexual behavior. It referred to the women that they were engaging in this behavior with. Until very recently, a man who was married but had sex with a slave or a concubine or a prostitute was not considered to be adulterous. The adultery was only if the woman was married, then it was an adulterous relationship. So Bill Clinton, according to this sort of traditional definition of adultery, was not adulterous at all. Women have been literally operating under threat of death for being honest about their feelings and their experience. And so I think that's resulted in, first of all, a lot of confusion, a lot of pathology, a lot of unnecessary suffering, a lot of sort of medicalizing of very natural responses, like the whole discussion of hysteria that we get into in the book, which was essentially female sexual frustration, being treated by doctors by masturbating women. And yet nobody ever admitted that that's what was happening. Now you're asking what women have to say about this. I think we have to, have that context in mind when we're talking about this. Because there's research showing, for example, I remember one of them, I don't remember the researcher's name, but she asked men and women to say how many sexual partners they'd had and how many they thought was an ideal number over a lifetime. They got numbers, I think it was like 5. Women thought 5 sexual partners was about the right number, and men said about 10 or 12 or something like that. And then they hooked the subjects up to what they were told was a lie detector machine. And the numbers changed dramatically for the women, but not for the men. Again, I'm not saying women are liars. I'm saying that women have been acculturated to minimize their appetites and to downplay their experience. You're not going to get a straight answer from women, is what I'm saying, in most cases, unless they think they're hooked up to a lie detector. Or if we are able to reconfigure society in such a way that women feel empowered and respected and protected enough to be honest about these things. I often say to young men, if you want a society that is more amenable to sexual expression, you want to have more time, you want to hook up with more women, you want to have better times with women, what you need to do is make sure women feel protected and safe and relaxed. And then things will get much better for the men as well.
It's interesting. You mentioned Bangkok earlier, and I have to say that I do find in many parts of Asia that it might be surprising to the West, but women take on very central roles and have very, commanding positions in society in terms of business and whatnot. And then on the flip side, you do see it's much different than the States. And I say that in a positive way.
I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and I've always found it very interesting that a lot of the sort of the coolest cafes and bars and places where foreigners tend to congregate seem to be owned by older women who I think in many cases sort of accumulated their initial investment capital by being with Western men. We think that we understand what certain things mean, like words like prostitution or homosexuality or, whatever. Adultery was the example I just used. We think we know what we're talking about when we use those words, but those words are so culturally determined that we don't really know what we're saying until we go to that culture and see what's going on there. Homosexuality is an incredible example because we talk about homosexuality, and yet there are societies in which the people believe that semen contains the essence of masculinity. The boys who want to grow up to be the most masculine will perform oral sex on the older boys so that they will be able to ingest as much of that masculine essence as possible so that they'll grow up to be big, strong men. And within that culture, that's not considered homosexuality. There's probably not even a concept of homosexuality within that culture. That's considered typical male behavior. And in fact, it's a sign that, the more macho male behavior. What does that mean? We think we understand what that is, but we really don't. So, yeah, I agree with you. It's fascinating to go to other cultures and look at how they deal with things. I've spent most of my life living in Spain, an ostensibly Catholic culture, which you would think would be much more restrictive and uptight about sex, but it's actually far more relaxed about sexuality than the United States is.
Thinking about these long-term pair bonds that some people have been able to successfully have, I just have a hard time imagining that anyone goes through their life walking down the street happily in a pair bond and never looks over their shoulder. If you're a guy, never looks over his shoulder and just says, "Oh my, she was looking amazing." The idea that somehow or another we are only unequivocally built for one. Look, I'm not proposing that a pair bond, including myself, should be out cheating. That's not what I'm proposing. I'm just saying that the idea that we can't see beyond the one person in our field of vision is insanity because we are all doing it.
Right. And what it does is it undermines the relationship from the get-go because it creates an area in which you cannot be honest with this person that you're supposedly sharing your life with. It makes your sexuality something that is actually not being shared because neither one of you is able to be honest about what you're really thinking and feeling. I mean, it's crazy. Cheating is another one of those terms that we think we know what it means, but when you really start digging into it, everybody has a different definition. Some people think that cheating, if you look at porn, you're cheating. Other people would say if she thinks of another man while we're having sex, she's cheating. Other people would say oral sex doesn't count as cheating, only intercourse is cheating. In some cultures, it's not cheating if you have sex with someone other than your partner when you're on vacation. Or, if you pay for it, it's not cheating. There's a book called Lust in Translation that gets into all these different definitions. And, hearkening back to your earlier point about how women would describe their experience, there's a book coming out soon called Untrue by Wednesday Martin that I just read recently. Fantastic book where she really gets into this question of how our conception of female sexuality has been distorted by the fact that until very recently, I'm talking 30, 40 years ago, only men were studying these things. And so only men were reporting on on their findings, and with very few exceptions, like, Kinsey, they were finding that women have very little sexual desire and very little desire for novelty in their partners. And these very sort of comforting male biases and presumptions were confirmed by their research. But of course, once women started doing the research, then the findings changed radically, and we're starting to get a much more accurate, if disturbing for some men, vision of what human sexuality and female sexuality actually is.
Let's talk about disease. I would think one of the nice things about a pair bond, if it's maintained and if there is not by either party straying outside, it does damp down the possibility for venereal disease and other types of things that could come in if both or one of the members of the couple are going outside. What's your perspective there?
Yeah, that's true. Like many questions of disease, though, it didn't really become a big issue until you have the settled villages that came about with agriculture. All of the top 10 killers of humans, as far as disease goes, all came about with agriculture. All the influenzas and the smallpox and the tuberculosis, all these things came. These are all viruses or bacteria that jumped over from domesticated animals that we were living very close to. And then you also have things like cholera, malaria, which are diseases also of civilization because you have to have a certain population density for them to spread. You have people living in their own sewage and waste and stagnant water and all that. Most of the things that we consider to be dangerous diseases were not at all issues for hunter-gatherers pre 10,000 years ago. As far as sexually transmitted diseases go, when you have bands of hunter-gatherers, even if somehow someone got syphilis, which, would be I don't know how that would happen, but even if it happened, it would spread in that small band of hunter-gatherers, but because they're isolated, it wouldn't spread through a larger population. The population density just isn't sufficient for those sorts of epidemic diseases to take root and spread. I think you're right, but I think that monogamy would not have had that sort of protective feature until the advent of agriculture when these things became an issue.
Chris, I have one big takeaway last question for you. But before that, just kind of one quick fun question that I want to ask, which is circumcision. I don't know if there's any debate about what you write about, but I would love for you to explain why we currently have circumcision.
Well, in the United States, of course, there are religious traditions of circumcision, but in the United States, the primary reason is sort of a lingering anti-masturbation program for boys, which was sort of at its height in the early 20th century. Before the war on drugs, we had the war on masturbation, and it was just as vicious and insane. Essentially, in the United States, it's a war on pleasure. If you think about it, we're supposed to be working all the time. We're not supposed to be having any fun or feeling good. I mean, even now when they're relaxing the prohibition against marijuana, everybody's trying to figure out a way to get the medicinal benefits without anybody getting high, like giggling is a big problem somehow. But circumcision comes back to John Harvey Kellogg and Graham, who were the anti-masturbation sort of leaders of that hysterical program against masturbation. And they advocated circumcision. They also advocated for boys who weren't circumcised, sewing the foreskin closed so that any erection would cause extreme pain. They advocated pouring carbolic acid onto the clitoris of girls who touch themselves inappropriately. It's just the brutality and the sort of the rage against natural human sexual curiosity and pleasure is just shocking.
Some of it still exists today, as I mentioned earlier, the female circumcision. I mean, there's just absolutely no excuse for that at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think, generally I tend to be a bit of a cultural relativist in most things, but there are some areas where I agree with you. It's just inexcusable.
You've been at this field for a long time, working on multiple books, really digging through. Can I ask your biggest aha moment? Like is there one moment, I don't know if it was the start of your career or if there was something that happened in research. Was there this one moment that you can recall that it just feels brighter than all the others in terms of you gathering insights? Because look, you didn't know all of the things that you know now at a certain point in time. You've had to do a lot of work to gather all of these insights and connect all the dots. But was there a particular moment that really was more bright for you?
I feel very fortunate in that there have been a lot of moments like that in my life where I've had the freedom to just sort of float around and arrive at insights in an organic, spontaneous sort of way. I would say one of the more pivotal moments was I was an undergraduate in college, and I was on a certain career path. My plan was to go to Oxford and do a PhD as soon as I finished my undergrad. and then teach. I was studying literature at the time. I was going to teach literature and, be an academic. And I love the literature that I was reading. And interestingly, the sort of area I was most interested in was called the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Whitman and Herman Melville and these sort of Ralph Waldo Emerson, people who were very interested in. It was almost like an American Buddhism that was happening in the mid 1800s. Also a lot of adventure, a lot of travel, Herman Melville with Moby Dick and his books about whaling and being out in the South Pacific, and Joseph Conrad. I found a way to skip my junior year of college. It was basically a loophole in the student handbook that I figured out. I was able to skip my junior year and still graduate on time. So I took that year and I hitchhiked to Alaska and spent the summer working in Alaska. And I hitchhiked from New York to Alaska and back. So I had lots of adventures along the way. I think that what changed for me there was that before I went, I thought the world was a very dangerous place. I sort of believed the dominant narrative that the best thing to do was to get a stable job and try to get, recognition and status and security and all these things that the culture tells you to strive toward. And once I got out and was hitchhiking around, I found that people were incredibly kind to me and generous, and people were picking me up on the highway and taking me home and feeding me and, letting me sleep on the sofa and then giving me a ride back out to the highway the next day. And one woman insisted on buying me a new pair of shoes because my shoes were so ratty. And just so much kindness and generosity in the world. And that sort of, it shifted the way I thought about life. It shifted the way I thought about the world. And from there on, I traveled all around the world. I spent my 20s and 30s backpacking all over Asia, South America, everywhere. It really opened things up for me. And I guess the aha moment was this sense that most of what I've been told about the world was bullshit. And most of what I've been told about other people and other cultures was not true. And there's an agenda underlying that story that I've been told, that every society celebrates itself and demonizes the other. And yet people are something that exist on a level separate from society. We're animals, as we started this conversation by saying, and we're actually pretty beautiful animals. We're designed by nature to take care of one another, to trust one another, and to feel good when we help one another. And so there's a level at which human beings exist in the natural world that is actually very beautiful and kind and generous, not because, we're endowed with some great spirit or something, just because that's the way our ancestors lived and it worked for them. That's how we survived as a species. And those things are very deep in us. And so the cultural message telling us, what I call the neo-Hobbesian message, telling us that it's a dog-eat-dog world and everyone's out to get you and you got to kill or be killed, that's not true. That's something that's being sold to us in order to manipulate our behavior. But if you strip away those cultural messages, the animal that underlies all this is actually a pretty beautiful beast.
To sum it up, and I don't usually like to typically swear on an interview, but basically, if you don't travel, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, particularly to tease out what is cultural, what is personal, and what is universal, right? That's always been my modus operandi, right? Like I've got my personal biases, as we all do. I've got my cultural hangups. I'm American. I'm middle class. I'm white. I'm, whatever, heterosexual. But then what's universal? What is it that we all share? That's what's really interesting to me. And so that's why I've studied things like consciousness and shamanism and altered states of consciousness and ethnobotany and sexuality, because these are things that all human beings engage in. and that we share, and, laughter, comedy. There are different things that we all have in common. And that's what I find really fascinating. And that gives me some sense of hope and optimism moving forward.
Chris, cool stuff. I will track you down when the next book comes out for sure. Hey, where can we send people? Where's the best place to send my audience into your world? Of course, Amazon, they can find books, but where's the best place we can send people?
My website is thatchrisryan.com.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
It was fun talking to you, Michael. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.